The Trump administration has just violated international law, specifically Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter, by kidnapping the sitting president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and placing him on trial under drug trafficking charges that critics across the global south and international legal scholars describe as politically motivated and fraudulent. Now ask yourself this: can you imagine if Russia or China sent a helicopter into the US, turned off all electricity, and the lights just went off in Washington, D.C. and kidnapped the American president? There would be wall-to-wall coverage, emergency UN sessions, sanctions, and threats of war. But because the United States did it, corporate media is treating this not as an act of war, but as a political development. Now, under international law, the forcible seizure of a head of state is a grave breach of sovereignty and an act of aggression. But we're once again reminded that international law does not exist, and this is a rogue state committing a crime. Yet instead of reporting on that fact, Western corporate media is pushing the same script across all platforms.
Venezuela has a lot of bad people in there, a lot of bad people that shouldn't be leading. We're not going to take a chance that one of those people take over for Maduro.
And that's the problem with a lot of these nations where a dictator takes over, is that once they get in power, as soon as it's time for them to die or leave, they will put other people in the place that are part of their either their power vacuum or their criminal enterprise.
The operation to topple Nicolás Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela, began in the early hours after days of waiting for the right weather.
It's absolutely incredible, isn't it?
And we would continue to reserve the right to take strikes against drug boats that are bringing drugs towards the United States, that are being operated by transnational criminal organizations, including the Cartel de los Sols. Of course, the leader of that cartel, is now in U.S. custody and facing U.S. justice.
We're going to do something about drugs. We're acting with striking drug boats. This is a president of action.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world. We're in the oil business. We're going to sell it to them. We're not going to say we're not going to give it.
Right now, from CNN to the BBC, we're also being flooded with footage of wealthy Venezuelan expatriates in Miami celebrating, cheering, waving flags, and calling this liberation. And across social media, many of these viral videos of Venezuelans celebrating Trump abducting their leader are actually AI. They're fake, and they're being shared by right-wing influencers like Nick Shirley to their millions of followers. What you're not being shown are the millions of Venezuelans in the streets of Caracas, protesting foreign U.S. intervention, denouncing sanctions, and rejecting U.S. interference in the kidnapping of their elected president. Because at the same time that these images and the same script are repeated and amplified, corporate media is recycling the same narrative to justify a so-called humanitarian intervention, to justify regime change. We've seen this script before in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and across the global south. First, the leader is dehumanized. Then the country is morally simplified, and legitimate frustration with economic issues is weaponized to be used for calls for regime change. Then before you know it, international law disappears. Luxury watches, starving people, brutal police committing rape. This is manufactured consent. And as Noam Chomsky famously stated, any dictator would admire the uniformity of the US corporate media. And while, of course, there is legitimate concern for the economic crisis in Venezuela, mainstream media is leaving out the important context that the US maximum pressure sanctions regime, one of the most aggressive economic sieges imposed on any country not at war, is to blame. US officials, including figures like John Bolton, have openly stated that the purpose of economic sanctions is to create enough suffering that people turn against their own government. And that suffering is not a mistake. It is the policy. US sanctions against Venezuela have blocked essential medicines, including cancer treatments, diabetes medication, dialysis supplies, food imports, hospital equipment, and industrial machinery. Multiple humanitarian studies link US sanctions to hundreds of thousands of people dying in Venezuela because of US sanctions preventing these life-saving medicines from entering the country. Yet, CNN and the BBC rarely lead with this. Instead, they tell you Venezuela collapsed because of one man, and that man is Nicolás Maduro. This is the part corporate media almost never tells you. As Venezuela was being strangled by US US sanctions, it actually turned to another sanctioned country, which was Iran. Two countries under economic siege began cooperating to keep people alive. Iran sent in food, fuel, medicine, and humanitarian supplies. And this was not an act of charity, it was solidarity between two countries punished for resisting US and Israeli imperial power. And how did the US respond? They seized Iranian ships carrying hundreds of tons of aid to Venezuela in international waters. This is state piracy. When Venezuela tried to feed its people, the ships were seized by the US Navy. When Iran tried to help, the cargo was taken. And then corporate media blamed who? Venezuela for the shortages. And of course, Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in Latin America, alongside vast gold and mineral wealth. But US sanctions have actually prevented Venezuela from importing refinery parts, drilling equipment, mining, machinery, and other things to be able to access their own resource wealth. So despite enormous resources, the country is prevented from accessing its own wealth. This is not mismanagement, this is economic strangulation. And this is where US intentions become very clear. The head of the US Southern Command, Laura Richardson, has openly stated that Latin America's oil, gold, lithium, and rare earth minerals are vital to US military and technological dominance. So this is about supply chains for weapon systems, surveillance tech, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicles. And it explains why governments that refuse to open resources to Chevron and ExxonMobil are targeted. Within 12 hours of capturing President Maduro, Trump went on Fox News to say that the US is now ready to take over Venezuela's oil industry. Corporate media also insists Venezuela's elections are corrupt. Well, I was in Venezuela in 2021 as an independent international election observer. I saw the process with my own eyes, along with hundreds of other observers from around the world to monitor the elections. And here's what we found. Venezuela's elections are among the most transparent and heavily audited in the world, with biometric verification, paper trails, public audits, and international observers. But when elections produce outcomes Washington dislikes, they are declared illegitimate, not because of fraud, but because of politics. Meanwhile, US elections dominated by corporate money, lobbying, and even foreign influence by countries like Israel are never sanctioned or delegitimized. The double standard is obvious. And notice something else. Corporate media has largely abandoned the drug trafficking narrative. Why? Because it collapsed under scrutiny. If Donald Trump and Marco Rubio really cared about drug trafficking, they would examine political protection and pardons at home, like the fact that Trump just pardoned one of the world's biggest cocaine traffickers, former Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez. But the truth is, it doesn't even matter. For decades, the US has funded and legitimized Venezuelan opposition groups, including factions that engaged in extremely violent destabilization. Public records show tens of millions of dollars funneled through US aid and the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED. During the Guarimbas, opposition-linked groups used firearms, Molotov cocktails, and improvised explosives, killing civilians and attacking public institutions. But when violence by opposition failed, US pressure on the Venezuelan government escalated. They increased sanctions, blockades, and blackouts, and extraterritorial threats. But history seems to have repeated itself. In 2002, the US backed a coup against revolutionary leader and Venezuelan President Hugo Chávez. Chávez was detained, removed, and flown out in a helicopter by the CIA, replaced by a US-backed regime that immediately dismantled democratic institutions. What stopped it was not international law, it was the Venezuelan people. Millions that supported Chávez and the Bolivarian Revolution flooded the streets. The military fractured and the coup collapsed. Chávez was returned because popular resistance made regime change impossible. And of course, we can't talk about the US plot to overthrow the Venezuelan government and topple the Bolivarian Revolution without talking about Israel and Palestine. The US-backed opposition leader Maria Corina Machado has openly pledged to open oil to US corporations, reverse nationalization of resources, and establish an Israeli embassy inside of Venezuela. That would end Venezuela's historic solidarity with Palestine, which Hugo Chávez made a national cause that Maduro carried on. Now, in the days leading up to intensified pressure on Maduro, Israeli officials were engaging regional partners, including in Paraguay, to discuss removing Maduro. And leading Israeli newspapers have called Venezuela a problem that needs to be solved for decades for its alliance with Iran and support for Palestinian liberation. Now, Venezuela's resistance to US and Israeli imperialism is not incidental. It is one of the main reasons it is being targeted. All of this leads to one unavoidable conclusion. This is not a campaign against a president. It is not even just a campaign against a government or drug trafficking. This is a war on the Bolivarian Revolution itself. The Bolivarian Revolution represents something Washington cannot tolerate: working class, independence, national sovereignty, public control of resources, and a political project that openly rejects capitalism, US domination, and Israeli imperialism. It is a model rooted in the idea that a country's wealth should serve its people, not multinational corporations, not foreign militaries, and not global elites. It is a model that has inspired countries across the global south to seek independence and resist US imperialism. That is the real threat, and that is why Venezuela has faced sanctions, economic siege, media demonization, violent opposition funding, attempted coups, and now the normalization of abducting its leaders. What all of this proves is simple. International law does not stop the US and Israel from committing war crimes. The so-called rules-based international order is selectively enforced, used against the global south, and discarded when inconvenient. The US asserts the right to sanction populations, starve economies, remove governments, and criminalize sovereignty. Corporate media exists to normalize this, but history shows us something else. The Chávez coup failed because the people refused it. Venezuela's resistance continues because the people refuse it. When international law is ignored, only popular resistance remains. And that, not media scripts or propaganda, is what decides the future. I'm Mnar Adley, and this is Behind the Headlines.